What is good, Ambush, and welcome to another episode of the Desert Tiger Podcast. And this week on the DTP, it is Vance Nevada 2 Electric Beefy Boogaloo. With me here, your host on the DTP. My name is Colton G, and as I'm sure you guessed this week, it is the second round with our guest Vance Nevada. I mean, you guys have already listened to last week's episode featuring Vance, so I'm sure we don't have to get into much of an introduction about him. We'll talk a little bit about what we're going to get into with this conversation after a few words, and of course we'll get into those right now. So first off, I just want to let you know that the best place where you can go ahead and support the Desert Tiger Podcast is, of course, ilovedtp.com. And like I also said last week, unfortunately, our merch provider is definitely closed down right now. Apparently, merchandise is not considered an essential service here in Canada, so we're not going to be getting those hats and toques for a while, but as soon as we get them, they are going to be up inside of the merch store so that you can get your hands on them as soon as you can. This week's episode is also brought to you by the premier streaming app and website for combat sports, including pro wrestling, MMA, and boxing, and that is Fight TV. Spelled FITE.TV, and you can find them in your app store and on their website. And we're also brought to you today by Audible, and they are giving you the Ambush one free audio book with a 30-day trial subscription of the Audible service, and you can check them out at audibletrial.com/Desert Tiger. All right, you guys. Yes, it is a second helping of Beefy Goodness as Vance Nevada joins me again. This week we discuss his work as a wrestling historian and as an author with his 2010 release, Wrestling in the Canadian West. How did he go about researching and compiling all of the information that it happens to contain? And does he plan on writing another book about Canadian wrestling history? We also talk about the Cauliflower Alley Club and their annual wrestling conference in Las Vegas. Vance is currently the editor of their newsletter, The Ear, and has been involved with the Cauliflower Alley Club in various forms. He has quite a few stories about them, and he was even booked to be a speaker at this year's conference, which has been postponed to September of 2020. So come get down with Vance Nevada once again for the Electric Beefy Boogaloo 2, as we discuss his work as a historian and as an author, the importance of the Cauliflower Alley Club, two very different people in Western Canadian history, and even a little bit more advice for wrestlers still earning their dues. All right, let's jump into it with Vance Nevada.
The Desert Tiger Podcast.
All right, once again, we are joined by Vance Nevada. This time around, we're talking about a book that he wrote in 2010. I can't remember the exact title of it, but The History of Wrestling in the Canadian West?
Wrestling in the Canadian West. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So, I happened to just recently borrow this book off of a good friend, Nick Slazinski. I never know how to pronounce Nick's last name, but
sure.
Of Thrash Wrestling. So I just happened to be diving through a lot of this book, and just the immense amount of history that you have inside of it and just everything you covered is incredible. But I want to know, how do you go about gathering the history for a region such as Western Canada, where maybe necessarily like everyone knows of Stu Hart and everything of that, and that's a little more well documented, but how do you go about getting the information for all of the other clubs around Western Canada, especially the smaller ones that only maybe ran for like a year or two?
Sure. I think like a lot of the big successes of my career, starting the book was actually like a big fluke. What happened was I'd been wrestling for about a year. This is about 1994. And I was watching a playback of one of my early matches on TV. We had television on Shaw Cable in Winnipeg. And one of the commentators said of my match, this guy is was trained by Ernest Frenchie Rowe, who was a longtime tag team partner of Frenchie Champagne. And they were a great tag team and held many championships. And I'd never heard of Frenchie Champagne before. And as a guy who was like a diehard wrestling fan for that point up 8 years, peripherally aware of wrestling before that, but, a diehard fan, with the cockiness of an 18-year-old, I thought, Frenchie Champagne, I never heard of that guy. And I know everything about wrestling, of course, because I'm 18, I know everything about everything. He must not have been a very big deal. I was curious enough that I wanted to find out about Frenchie Champagne, particularly because they had made this reference to my trainer, Ernest Rowe, being a tag team champion somewhere. So I wanted to find a press clipping or a photo of that and actually give back to my trainer as kind of a respect for, hey, thanks for selling me my first pair of boots and teaching me 3 moves and opening the door for me to get into wrestling. So that summer, I got into the Winnipeg archives and started going through the Winnipeg Free Press and going through the old issues of the newspaper. And I found Frenchie Champagne in there. And this is like not internet like newspapers.com that we've got access to now. This is like reeling through hours and hours of microfilm. And so I would find a clipping and I would write down the results of the match and the show. And it became a whole summer of activity, and I found lots on Frenchie Champagne. I never actually did find any evidence that Ernie Rowe wrestled on a show with Frenchie Champagne. That was all fabricated. But Frenchie Champagne was a huge deal in Manitoba. He was kind of like the top headliner on Manitoba independent wrestling from 1953 to 74. And, he was a multiple-time heavyweight champion, a multiple-time tag team champion. He became a promoter later on and had this traveling ring that folded up and pulled behind his truck. But in that area in Winnipeg, he was the headliner of local shows. When the big show would come in from Minneapolis, he would be the referee on that show, so he had credibility with this rub from all the big names. But as I started to dig into it and see Frenchie Champagne, then I saw like the very earliest days of the career of Moose Morowski, who went on internationally to success, and Bulldog Bob Brown, and Roy McClarty, and Albert Olson, and Gordon Nelson, Bill Dromo, George Gordienko. And you're like, wait a minute, Winnipeg was such a huge hotbed of wrestling. The relationship with Minneapolis, and then guys were getting into the States and into Europe and into Japan. And it was enough of a hook to get me going. So I was researching Manitoba, started to trade results with guys who were Stampede wrestling historians, and they sent me their stuff. And then it just evolved into this project where I'd collected results for Western Canada, more than 30,000 events chronicled from 1867 to now. And we said, we need to do something with this, because you just can't give a book of results to people and have them understand the significance of that. So let's start to dissect this and actually document, what does this mean? And so we started putting together Wrestling in the Canadian West as a means of illustrating the depth of the history of the region, letting people know that, the Hearts and Stampede Wrestling were a huge part of it, but there was also Vancouver, and Vancouver had a very storied history with wrestling and produced a lot of stars over the years, and Winnipeg had a big role to play. And so when you put that all together, I remember when we were doing the book, it was really important to me to really capture the voices of the wrestlers that were involved. And so I called up Moose Morowski and said, Moose, I would love to interview you for a book. And he had seen some of the other books that had been published on Stampede Wrestling that were really just a celebration of the Hart family, and didn't really talk about anybody else. And he agreed to interview with me, but he said, listen, I'm going to come and sit down with you, but the only writer that's any good in Canada is Greg Oliver from Slam Wrestling. And so I said, well, I'll bring a draft of what I'm working on. You can kind of see, how it's going to play out. And if you want to participate, great. If you don't, that's fine too. And he sat down and looked through like an early draft, and he goes, wait a minute, you've talked about all of us. All of our names are in here. And I said, that's the goal. Like, we want to celebrate the Gil Hayes and the Moose Morowskis and the Dave Rules and the Eric Frolics and the Roy McClartys, because they were really the glue. You know, maybe they weren't necessarily the headliners, but they had long careers and were hugely instrumental in what was going on here. In the same way that, you know, a guy like gorgeous Michelle Starr isn't given enough credit for what he has done for the wrestling industry since 1991 when he started promoting, you know, with West Coast Championship Wrestling and then ECCW for the first 8 years of ECCW, 10 years of ECCW. And now with All Star, like Michelle Starr himself is probably responsible for promoting more than 1,000 shows, but also responsible for the development of Madison, who was NWA World Women's Champion, Sexy Samantha, who has wrestled internationally in Korea and all over Canada, the Singh brothers, Kyle O'Reilly, El Phantasmo, you know, the list goes on. Nicole Matthews, all got their start because Michelle Starr was there to give them a platform to begin. And I really wanted to pay tribute to those guys and really acknowledge that, you know what, if you think you know Canadian wrestling and you only know Stampede Wrestling, you really just know a small piece of the story. And it's been tremendously rewarding to see that book come to fruition and see that even 10 years later, people are still referencing it. A lot of pressure for a sequel to the book to say, yeah, let's take the book and now update it. What's happened in Western Canada the last 10 years? Mm-hmm. Every now and then I, you know, get the itch to maybe start putting that together, and then it's a conflict between sometimes, particularly in the period where I wasn't involved with wrestling, I was just kind of low on it, and I thought, well, why do I want to write that? I hate all those people, you know, or you know, I'm going to put this book out there, but you know, they're not really going to promote it on their side, and it was really successful in terms of sales, because I was also a touring wrestler at the time. So you wrote the book, and now you're actually in the venues with wrestling fans, not at bookstores, with a book. And sometimes the fun challenges were you'd be in the Cloverdale Arena and someone would come up and say, oh yeah, you got a book talking about wrestling? My dad was a wrestler. I bet he's not in the book. I said, well, if I can find his name in the book, are you committed to buy it? And they'd be like, yeah. Well, what was your dad's name? Oh, he wrestled under this name. And I flip to that page and say, there's his name right there. And you kind of like, you know, surprise. So, yeah.
No, that's one thing I was wondering too, because I've seen that you also did a little bit of the research into the East Coast history as well. So I was wondering if the update maybe would include some of the full of Canada, or is the East Coast history compilation sort of going to be left to someone who's a little more acclimated with that scene?
I think, you know, we've certainly talked about it. I got a good friend, Rob Seeley on the East Coast, who's the premier historian for the Maritimes, and we've talked about partnering on the next edition of making it a national wrestling history. I think the biggest challenge with that is, I mean, Quebec has been well covered in the work that Pat LaPrade and Bertrand Hebert have done. Ontario is a very interesting scene, you know, altogether. But we want to make sure that if we do it, the information is as complete as possible and it's done right. And it's a big, big project when you get into actually interviewing people. So I wouldn't rule out that there could be, you know, a follow-up down the road of one of those books, or do something more on Canadian wrestling history, because especially now that I'm back immersed, there's some talent that I would really like to showcase and spotlight and give visibility to, but it's a big job.
I can only imagine that compiling, and then just how you had it the first time where it was done on like a timeline type basis, compiling the information, and then, oh, this actually happened then, and then just like moving everything around. And
yeah, and I think it's you know, the research has never stopped. And if I knew now, if I knew in 1994 what I know now about how big the project is, I probably would have never started. Because now the collection of results alone is 3,800 pages of material. It's been really awesome, because if someone gets in touch with me and says, hey, I'm looking for research on my grandpa who used to wrestle or whatever, if it is legit, I've got it. So we've also been able to debunk a lot of fakers out there. My favorite one is a guy out of I think he's in Oregon, who claims that he wrestled in Canada in the 70s as the Super Tramp, and because there has been so little information on Canadian wrestling, and the focus was all on the Hearts, no one could really debunk that or myth bust it. So I was able to go through some of the things that he had said in interviews, saying, I debuted in Calgary in this month in 1975, and my first match was against this guy. And then to go through the actual results and say, first of all, your name shows up nowhere in the history in all 7,000 plus shows that Stampede ever ran under your real name or under this assumed name or any variation of that. The guy that you said you wrestled in your first match wasn't even in the Stampede territory that year at all. So this is total bullshit. Because that really bothers me. Like, there are legitimate veterans out there that don't get the praise that they deserve, and then you got these boneheads out there saying, oh yeah, I was a Stampede wrestler, or who never laced up their boots ever. And then they always have these creative stories about, well, I don't have any pictures because I went through a nasty divorce and my wife burned everything, or my boots, when they got broken, I threw them out. And I don't know if any wrestler with broken down boots has ever thrown them out because they're such a badge of honor.
I threw all my gear out the window one night.
I just got frustrated with wrestling and I burned it all. Myself, the pair of boots that I gave away when I got out of the business, as I was getting ready for my match, first match was CWE. I thought it'd be my only match. I actually ran into the guy that had them and said, listen, I've got this one match coming up. I'd like to get my boots back. So I wrestle in my own boots.
Oh, wow.
And he was cool. And he said, yeah, absolutely. And then when I got them, once I had them in my hand again, I realized, I never, ever wanted to give them away. And so I called them and I said, listen, I feel really bad that I've kind of like gave them to you and now I'm not giving them back. They mean too much to me. But just so that I'm not a jerk, let me buy you a new pair of boots. So I could have just bought myself a new pair. And eventually I did, because my boots were so beat up that I can't actually use them. But those are the boots that I wore traveling coast to coast in Canada. Those are the boots that I wore when I got to wrestle for the NWA World Championship.
They were a part of your story.
Yeah. So, yeah, the book process was really, really interesting and really rewarding. So now that history is out there, documenting so many guys. And I think, in the end, there was lots of guys that were really appreciative of the book, and I've got lots of photos of people doing the photo endorsement. I think I only had 2 people that were upset. One was Jason the Terrible from Stampede Wrestling, because the book features a road story about him that isn't very flattering. And I think the embarrassing thing about that was we were at a book signing, and he was a special guest with me at the book signing. He'd never seen the book, and we're sitting there side by side, and he's flipping through the book, trying to find his name in there, and then he found this story, and we're like an hour into a 3-hour book signing, and he's like, "Well, this isn't the way it happened at all," right? And he just sat there, and anybody that came up to him and said, "Hey, are you in the book?" He's like, "Yeah, but there's an untrue story about me in there." And he was just sour for the rest of the afternoon, and that really sucked.
Oh, wow.
And then the other guy was a promoter out of Winnipeg named Mike Davidson, who had done some stuff in the early 2000s. He had probably the greatest success of anyone in wrestling at finding these money marks to fund his grandiose ideas. But, it's got really kind of I think if there is an update, some of it will sort of talk about some of the shady things that had happened. Some of it is captured in the book, which is why he's upset with me. And he had actually put out a bounty on my head.
Oh.
And he had told wrestlers, anyone who gives Vance Nevada a bloody nose and sends me proof of that is booked on my next show in Winnipeg for top pay. And, me and my colleagues always had a good laugh about that. Principal Pound, who used to wrestle out of Regina, when this first happened, he came into the locker room one night and slammed his bag down next to me in the locker room, and he says, "I'm here to collect the bounty." And we had a good chuckle about just the ridiculousness of that. But, Mike's first first money mark that he found was up for fraud charges for some kind of a telemarketing scam. And he ended up mysteriously dead. It was ruled a suicide out of a 4th-story hotel room window in downtown Winnipeg.
Yeah, that seems legit.
Yeah, and, another guy that he was involved with ended up getting busted on major fraud charges for some kind of a prepaid student card kind of scam. He's currently serving time in prison. And so, you just sort of talk about, and it wasn't that we didn't give people an opportunity to tell their story. I reached out to every promoter, regardless of any political stripe, and said, tell me from your perspective. And that's how the book was written. And in Mike's case, I approached him a couple of times. He said, yeah, I'll get you some stuff. And then eventually I'm like, you know what, we're getting to press time and you haven't sent me anything. So now I've interviewed the wrestlers that have worked with you. And, I guess the story will be told based on their accounts of working with you. And he had sent me back an email saying, well, I look forward to reading about all my failures. But then when it actually came out and people had said the things that they had said about the experience, and then you reference actual court records and rulings and things like that, he wasn't really happy about it. And, so we haven't really spoken since, and my life isn't that much poorer for it. I mean, every now and then he'll take a pot shot at me indirectly or whatever, and, do your thing, man.
That's exactly it. I mean, if that's what he wants to do, and if he wants to continue to allow that to affect him, well, those were his decisions. So
yeah. So, personally, I don't have any ill will towards the guy. I wish him the greatest success in everything that he does. I hope that whatever he's into, he finds happiness in doing that. One of the things that is always interesting with independent wrestling is that people will do things for the wrong reasons. They decided that they're going to promote because they're upset about the way that they were being used in another company, or they think that other promoter isn't doing it right, or they've got a better idea to make money. But if you're doing wrestling of a general passion for wrestling, and you really see that with companies like Thrash, they're kind of like the underdogs of BC wrestling, but they just are so passionate about wrestling. And you just can't help but love it. And you see the characters that they've got in the locker room, and there's some really great talent there.
Most of the people there are just want to learn, and like any chance to learn, they just soak it up, which is something that I love about being inside of that locker room.
Yeah, so if I was to do a sequel to the book, I think that, it would be because of companies like Thrash Wrestling, where the book kind of left off as they were getting started. And now let's talk about this 10-year journey of a company that was maybe initially dismissed as being a bunch of backyarders. And, the longevity and the success that they've been able to have, and the talent they've been able to produce. Because there's guys there like Jade is fantastic. Camaro Cope is great. Braden Goss and whatnot. And yeah, I've had some enjoyable times in a thrash ring over the years as well.
And it's crazy how some of those people who got written as backyard style wrestlers, how it was those people who were like so dedicated that they're the ones that are still running their shows and still putting in as much effort as they still possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the story of wrestling continues to be told, and whether it's a sequel to the original book or a new book that or something that's specific to the story of thrash wrestling, that allows you to really go in depth on the characters that have made that a very heartfelt brand. This it's like the continuing story of pro wrestling.
It absolutely is.
So many stories to tell.
There truly is a plethora of them, and now that we know the why you decided to become a wrestling historian and why you wrote Wrestling in the Canadian West, I want to dive a little bit more into your research process here, a little bit more about the Cauliflower Alley Club. But before we get there, we're going to take a little bit of a break so that we can talk about the premier streaming app and service for combat sports. And of course, you guys know that I am talking all about Fight FITE.TV. That is FITE.TV. And you guys heard me last week how I was telling you all about how Fight TV is trying to help those of you who maybe are feeling the punch of the current crisis, maybe feeling a little bit of a hurt on the wallet, by how Fight TV is given a discount on a lot of their previous pay-per-views that they happen to have. Well, to also go ahead and help you out, Fight has also gone and launched the Fight 24/7 channel on both the app and the website, and there is always a match going on in any of those three categories that they carry. That's right, hard-hitting pro wrestling, MMA, and boxing action on the Fight 24/7 channel, and it's for free in your app store on the Fight TV website right now. Once again, that is FITE.TV for the hardest hitting streaming service you can find today.
The Desert Tiger Podcast.
So you mentioned that you had a network of different researchers to pull a lot of information from. Was there any moments where you yourself had to go to different territories and maybe get into different archives or contact different people who maybe had the information but maybe didn't necessarily have it organized or any of that matter?
When I started wrestling, I always kept track of everything that I was doing. So I kept the results for the shows I was on and kept a record of my own career. And, I just kind of thought loosely that other people must do that. And nobody's done that.
Nobody does that.
And so I would, early on when I was doing the research for the book, I had just a printout of all the results. And I would bring them on the road trips with guys that were more veteran and say, hey, here's what I've got. Can you help me fill in the gaps? And they would look at it and be like, I have no idea, man. We were just so busy living the life, we don't know, and it all blurs together. And now, as I'm more experienced, I understand that. I meet with people and they say, yeah, we had a great match once in Vancouver. And I'm like, I'm not even sure I've met you before. Or they'll say, you know what, I really appreciate that advice you gave me one time. And I'll have to say to them, can you remind me what that was? Because I don't remember. And they would say, yeah, you said this. And I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like something I would say. Sometimes I just nod thoughtfully, not on that I don't know. But what that led to originally was, okay, if I can't just print the results and give them to someone, let's research their individual career and give it to them, because then they'd be able to identify the gaps. So I started doing that, where I'd go on a road trip with Chi Cruz or something and say, hey, here's your career. And be like, oh, well, in this period in June, I was in the Maritimes, or I was in Germany, or I was in South Africa. And so you now got a lead to go and follow those things, even if it wasn't the core research that I was doing for the book. And so I started doing the individual careers, and that actually has become a passion project in itself, that now I've researched the individual careers of more than 200 wrestlers, not just Canadian wrestlers, but some of the top stars in the business. And really, originally I did it as a sort of a supporting exercise for the Canadian book. But when the book was done, I compiled the career history for Don Leo Jonathan. Don Leo was a second-generation wrestler out of Utah. He started in the 1950s, had his last match in Vancouver in 1980, was a huge star for this region in the Pacific Northwest. And I did it as a thank you to Don Leo for taking the time out. He invited me over to his home. We had 2 or 3 sit-downs, just so gracious. So I came back on a following visit and gave him his career. And I had 2,800 matches for Don Leo Jonathan all over the world. And he was paging through it, and he's like, wow, this name, I haven't thought about this person in 40 years. And he was just so blown away and touched by the effort. He said, would you mind printing off 3 more copies of this? Because I'd like to give a copy to each of my kids. And I thought, well, now this is good. Now I've done something of value to pay back. So I started doing that with all the guys that did the interviews for my book. So I did one for Moose Morawski, did one for Dean Ho. Then I thought, you know what, that was so rewarding. I was going to the Cauliflower Alley Club the following year, and took a look at who was going to be there. And I said, oh, Ted DiBiase's going to be there. I can't remember who else. Ted DiBiase was kind of the highlight for me that year. So I researched Ted DiBiase's career, but his dad and his mom were also both wrestlers. So I researched their careers and put it all together. So met Ted DiBiase, said, "Hi Ted, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a big, long-time fan of your work. I've just put this together for you." So it had his career, and then I said, "Yeah, if you go past this tab, here's your dad's career. If you go past this tab, here's your mom's career." And he started to tear up instantly. And he said, "This is amazing. I don't know how you found all of this." His dad had died when Ted was 16 years old. So he was aware of his career, saw him wrestle as a kid, but had no records of it. And so now here's his whole career. And his mom, he was aware had wrestled, but had no records of it at all. She had just told a few stories from time to time. And now here's a record of her career. And off of that, we became friends instantly and continue to be friends to this day. And so that sort of started, a new tradition for me that every year I'd go to Cauliflower Alley, I would take 3 or 4 more record books of guys that were going to be there. So now I've got over 200 records. And what I've done is I've printed the record book for them to keep. I print an extra copy of the cover and have them sign it back to me. So now I've got this binder of career record books, which is like a one-of-a-kind memorabilia collection with Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, Steve Austin, Ric Flair, Tully Blanchard, Arn Anderson, Barry Windham, Demolition, Paul Orndorff. And it's just like, that's probably my prized collection. This year, going to Cauliflower Alley, I've been putting together the record books for Brian Blair, Dominic DeNucci, probably a few more that I get put together before we get to Vegas. But it just another way of sort of taking that documented history and making sure that the contributions of those men and women in the business don't get lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So how long have you been involved with the Cauliflower Alley Club?
The first year that I went to Cauliflower Alley, they used to travel around. So it was originally started in the 1960s in Los Angeles, and we just started as an annual lunch. So they would have a luncheon and bring the wrestlers together. And the founder, Mike Mazurki, who was also an actor, had a lot of connections with Hollywood people. So you'd have Hollywood celebrities hanging out with wrestlers. And it became a fraternal organization very early on, a benevolent organization where, because Mike Mazurki was doing so well for himself financially, guys that weren't would come to him and say, "Hey, I'm falling on hard times," or this is what's happened. And in those days, wrestlers couldn't get insurance for themselves, so he'd say, "Hey, so and so's in trouble. They need some money. They need $2,000. I'm gonna put in $500. How much can I count you in for?" And would sort of just like informally, pass the hat among the wrestlers, and wrestlers would take care of themselves. Would take care of your community. And that club has evolved over the years, and they would travel around, take the reunion to different cities. So the first year I went was in 1999, when it was held in Newton, Iowa, in conjunction with the opening of the new Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame Museum there. And so I had a chance to meet directly, Lou Thez and Vern Gagne and Harley Race, and the original Destroyer, Red Bastien. And at that time, I was like a 20-year-old kid, in 22 or 23 years old, in this environment with all of these legends. It was incredible, and get to sit at a table with them and have dinner and hear their road stories. And then they moved the reunion to Las Vegas, and I hadn't been for a few years, but I got the call that because of my book, I was being nominated for the James C. Melby Historian Award. And you can only win an award if you're a member. So I'm like, I better renew my membership. So I renewed my membership and went down in 2010. And that whole experience was just so surreal. Because, I'm up on the podium in a room full of 650 people. And I look out in the front row, and at the table right in front of me is Nick Bockwinkel, Ted DiBiase, and Terry Funk. And I just felt like this is so backwards. these are legendary world champions here, and I'm the guy being honored. And I looked down at my podium to look at my speech, which I'd probably rewritten 5 times, and it was all a blur. It was all squiggly lines. And so I just kind of spoke from the heart. And then you get your award. You go to the photo station. They take your photo with the award presenter, and other people can come and take a photo with you and sort of celebrate your night. But what I remember most about that experience was, as I was going back to my table in the banquet room, as I was passing Terry Funk, he stood up in his chair to shake my hand and congratulate me. And so I was like, this is wild, right? So I leaned in for the handshake, and he came in for the full half hug. And in my ear, he said, "I'm proud of you, son." And I just like start tearing up. It's just like such a incredible, heartfelt moment, you know. And I remember when I gave Terry his career record, he was emceeing the Cauliflower Alley that year. And so he got up on stage the next night and he said, "You know what? I've been married to my wife for 26 years. Everyone applauds, right? Yeah, yay. He goes, "But I just got my record book from Vance. And when I subtract all of the days I was on the road wrestling, and then all the days I was on the road traveling, and a couple nights I spent in jail for a bar brawl, we've actually only been married for 11 weeks. Just like huge comedy moment for the club. But so now a lot of the research that I've done, whether people have asked me for it directly or have referenced it otherwise, has been credited in other books. So most of the slam wrestling books, I've got an acknowledgement. A lot of Bertrand Hebert and Pat Laprad's books on Quebec got an acknowledgement. Angelo Mosca had a book written, and they actually published the career record that I had researched in the book. In the back. It wasn't complete. Like if they had told me they were doing it, I probably would have sent them a more updated one. So that's always really neat, when I get a book in the mail. Or Stephen Verrier out of Washington State, he did a book, first of all, like on the Pacific Northwest that covered BC, Washington, and Oregon. They referenced a lot of my work. And then he did a book on Gene Kiniski. So it's cool to see that, my work is referenced, and then I'm sort of acknowledged as a historian. Right now, Stephen is working on a book about George Gordienko, who is probably one of the greatest Canadian wrestler to never be world champion. So that'll be coming out hopefully sometime soon. So there is a lot of stuff out there, and a lot of work. And the Cauliflower Alley organization, I now publish the newsletter for the club, and I'm an active promoter, and really encourage young wrestlers that have an appreciation for the business or really think that this could be their career to get there, because you've got representatives from all the major companies that are there. You've got a lot of wrestlers of past and present that can be a help to you in terms of networking and connections. And it's just really an opportunity to immerse yourself in the culture of professional wrestling for a couple of days. And one thing that makes this event different than going to WrestleMania at a Fan Fest, for example, when you go to Fan Fest, you're just in line with the other fans, right? You're not actually getting, behind the curtain kind of access to any of those people. You've got your 5 seconds to get your autograph and your photo op, and off you go. At the Cauliflower Alley Club, when you show up, and I encourage you to come this year.
Oh, try to.
when you show up and go to the registration table and get your name badge, you are one of the boys. You're in the business, and we have no distinction there if you're a fan, if you're a ring announcer, if you're just the guy that takes the jackets to the back, if you're a promoter, referee, ring announcer, or a wrestler. If you're there, you're part of the brotherhood and sisterhood of wrestling. And so you might be on your way to breakfast one morning and you fall into step, and this happened with us. We were on our way to breakfast. It was Kevin Jeffries and myself, and we fell into step with Jerry Briscoe. And he said, "Hey, Jerry, you going for breakfast? Yeah. Are you alone? You want to dine with us?" And he came and joined us at the table, and we didn't talk wrestling at all. He wanted to talk about baseball. And actually, that year we had kind of a running rib that if you left your cell phone unattended on the table, that meant that anyone else could pick it up and take photos with it. And so we were dining with Kenny Dahl, who was a wrestler out of Newfoundland, a guy that I admire so greatly. His career got cut short because of a back injury, but now he's playing baseball in the Caribbean. So I don't know, he's probably doing better than us. But Kenny Dahl is a huge Boston Red Sox fan, and Jerry Briscoe is a huge Jacksonville fan. So when Kenny Dahl got up to go to breakfast, he left his phone on the table while Jerry Briscoe took a picture, of himself, pointing to his Jacksonville jersey and thumbs down to Boston, and just left it on his phone. And Dahl didn't see it, I don't think, until the next day. But it's just this memory of, I was having breakfast at Jerry Briscoe. He buried my baseball team. So many memories of just you're in the moment, or we're in the lounge after the formal program is done, and just everybody's there. So you're sitting there drinking beer with Pat Patterson, and he's telling stories, or me and Gene Okerlund, and or another guy that was awesome was Oliver Humperdinck, who was a manager in the territories on the WWE. And just total down to earth guys, and they're telling stories about the old territory days, or ribs that they pulled on guys, and just so complimentary, and just returning the respect of, hey, here's a young guy in the business who's come here because they respect the business and want to learn the traditions and the lessons that they might not get otherwise. So I love it, and I don't get down every year because of my schedule, but I try to get down every other year.
Are you going down this year?
And I will be there this year, yeah.
All right, fantastic. Are you taking part in any conferences, or being a part of the newsletter? Do they have you taking part of the actual conference in any official capacity?
Yeah, so there's one of the things that's a great advantage. So there's 2 nights of awards. So they, recognize different, wrestlers of the past and present. So they've got just the lineup of people that are getting awards this year, getting honors from Cauliflower Alley Club. Rob Van Dam, Rey Mysterio Jr., Alundra Blaze, the Road Warriors, Greg Oliver is getting the James Melby Historian Award this year. Men's Wrestling Award is going to Ricky Santana. Women's Wrestling Award is going to Jazz, former WWE Women's Champion. So fantastic lineup. And then they've also got awards recognizing the current generation. So they've got the Rising Star Award. Okay. This year is the first year they're acknowledging men and women because there's so much talent. And so Brian Pillman Jr. is going to be there for the Rising Star Men's Award. Okay. And Canadian Madison Miles is getting the Women's Award for Rising Star this year. And then they also have a seminar series. And the seminars are fantastic because it's really like a gloves off, uncensored, conversation. And whether it's topical and they're talking about, somebody's talking about the art of cutting a promo, or the art of refereeing, or whatever it could be. This year they've got a panel on the history of the British Columbia wrestling territory, and that's going to be a pretty packed stage. So we've got Bobby Bass from the 70s, Fidel Sierra, who wrestled as Fidel Cortez here in the early 80s, Michelle Starr for the 90s, Adam Ryder, Raven Lake, Greg Lake, Stuart Kemp are all there. I'm moderating that one. I think it's going to be a hard job just keeping everybody on task. There's also going to be a session this year on the Ice Road tours.
Tony
Candello tour, and some of the other tours that have taken place. So I get to participate on that one and kind of enlighten people, particularly in the southern U.S., who were like, what? You drive on the ice? What are you talking about? Tracy Smothers, who's a legendary wrestler from the southern states. He's got an hour and a half on stage just by himself talking about his life and career. And there's other seminars as well. So there's stuff to do to engage. If you're a cribbage player, you could be part of the cribbage tournament with all of these legendary wrestlers. There's a bowling tournament that usually happens every year, and then one of the events that's just kind of happened spontaneously, and it happened. They have 2 nights of live wrestling as well. So Sunday night there's a live show, Monday night there's a live show, and then Tuesday and Wednesday night are the awards dinners. But the last year after the Monday Night Wrestling match, you got all these guys hyped up on adrenaline, end up at the Red Zone Lounge in the Gold Coast Hotel and Casino, and everyone's kind of hyped up, and somebody started to do a Jackie Fargo strut. And then that was subject to artistic interpretation, so now it became a strut off.
Oh my.
And now this is an annual event. Now it's a tag team strut off that occurs, at 1 a.m. with all these adrenaline-charged wrestlers of past and present. And I think actually Madison Miles and Alex Zwicker took home the honors last year. They won the strut off. So
who, how do you judge a strut off?
Yeah, I think it's just by reaction of the crowd.
Okay, that's a good way to
in the
things.
purest form. It's a bunch of wrestlers sitting around after the matches, just as we do, and having some fun.
That's awesome. It sounds like it's a pretty good time all around. That you have a lot of different activities and events, and even just different people from different timelines. People like Madison, who currently has toured across Canada and is doing a lot of work in England, and then even like you said, a lot of the legends that you listed earlier that they seem to be recognizing and acknowledging. It seems it seems to be a good array of different timelines and people from different styles and everything. So.
Absolutely. So it's just one of the rarest type of events that there is out there. There's a lot of conventions and fan fests that happen throughout the year. This really is the only event for the wrestling community.
Huh.
And so you'll have people from the WWE management team will be there supporting their people that are being honored. But you also have Impact Wrestling guys from the office show up, and AEW is new, so and they tape on Wednesdays, so they might not be there this year. But
I'm sure they'll have somebody there.
You could have somebody that's got a night off and is there, and just such a. As somebody in the business, just to be immersed in that, and you catch up with people that you haven't seen in years, and you also meet some pretty diehard fans who have know your career better than you do yourself, and are excited. There's one guy there, Brian Westcott, who's really the heart of the club, and he'll show up. And the first year I went, he had a previous book that I'd done even before wrestling in the Canadian West. It was kind of almost an experiment, self-published. When I look at it now, I'm very embarrassed, but I did it at 23 years old.
Okay.
It's sort of the precursor to wrestling in the Canadian West, and it was just Surlock's binding printed at Staples, with very rudimentary layout skills that I had in Microsoft Word. I think it might have even been not even Word, it was Word Perfect. Black and white, grainy photos, the whole thing, a lot of typos. But he had a copy of this book that at that time was 10 years old, still in pristine condition. Wow. Without a crease, that he had brought with him from Idaho to Vegas to get signed. And just those types of fans that are now following your career and reach out to you hey, I met you in Vegas and good luck on your show tonight, or happy birthday, or whatever. So just really reinforces that as much as we feel that wrestling is divided across North America, we really are one big family. Within professional wrestling, within this niche, this culture of pro wrestling.
As divided as many of us are by highways and kilometers and locker rooms, at the end of the day, we're all have a love of the same industry.
Absolutely. And for podcast guys, it's a great opportunity to just corner someone and say, hey, do you have 20 minutes for me? We can go do this interview.
It definitely sounds like it would be full of incredible opportunities, and myself, any aspiring wrestlers, and any wrestling fans really should definitely think about checking out the Cauliflower Alley Club. Of course, they have rescheduled to September of 2020, and you can find out more information about that on their website. And you can also go ahead and pick up a membership to the club there as well. All right, we're going to be jumping into some details about some of the more interesting characters in the history of the Western Canadian wrestling scene right away here. But first off, we have to take another moment to shout out one of our wonderful sponsors here on the show, and of course that is Audible. Audible is giving you the ambush of Desert Tiger one free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership of the Audible service. And let me tell you, they have the largest collection of Audible audio programs available on the internet today, and that includes a plethora of wrestling novels, including Jim Ross's upcoming book that I'm definitely going to be checking out when it drops. That, of course, is known as Under the Black Hat. And if you're just impatient and just can't wait to check it out, maybe you also want to go ahead and catch yourself up with Jim Ross's first book, Slobber Knocker. That's actually what I'm listening to right now. I'm on chapter 9, and it is a fantastic listen. It's actually narrated by good old JR himself. So if you're a wrestling fan, that's a voice that's definitely going to ease you in as you go through this. And of course, how do you get this free audiobook with this 30-day Audible trial? Well, let me tell you, that's by going to audibletrial.com/Desert Tiger. Once again, that is AUDIBLE.com/Desert Tiger. All right, you guys, let's jump back into it with Vance Nevada.
The Desert Tiger Podcast.
All right, so I wanted to dive a little bit into some of the characters and some of the scenarios that really struck me from reading the book. But
Sure.
just from time, maybe let's just jump into some of the people that we've already spoken about already. So you happen to mention Don Leo.
Yeah.
Is that the same Don Leo that happens to have a win over a bear?
Yeah. Don Leo, he was considered to be a giant in his day. He was 6'7", 320 pounds.
My goodness.
So in the 60s and 70s, before Andre the Giant came along, Don Leo was the Mormon Giant. That was his name, and he was considered to be, this incredible main event talent, because even at 6'7" and 320 pounds, he could get up and throw a drop kick. And he was agile as hell and strong. And so in New Westminster at the Queen's Arena, Don Leo Jonathan was booked to wrestle a bear. And this was an attraction in those days, right? They would have this muzzled bear that they would bring around. And typically it was kind of a gimmick match, right? And there was a lot of ribs that happened because of the bear, right? So, I've heard stories about somebody was going to wrestle the bear. They were already nervous about it, and the other boys came up behind him just as he was going through the curtain, and had a handful of honey, and smacked him on the ass on his way through the curtain, and said, "Good luck out there tonight." Well, this bear was just going for that honey the whole match, so he's just chasing this guy's ass. But the bears were pretty playful, and you could sort of do spots, they would give you a snap mare and things like that. You'd get behind them in position, and they had a few moves that they could do. But typically, you knew that you were going to be doing the job to the bear. There's just no way. And Don Leo told me this story, and he said, I really had a greater appreciation for the bear. He was wrestling Terrible Ted, who was the prized star attraction for Dave McKigney, who wrestled as the Canadian Wild Man. In wrestling circles, he was known as the Bear Man. He was from Ontario, and he traveled with the bear, and his promotion was called Big Bear Promotions. So Terrible Ted came to Queen's Arena, and Don Leo, and this just speaks to the power of him, pinned the bear to the mat.
For a full 3 seconds.
For the full 3 seconds.
My goodness.
And he's the only one in history that I've seen documented anywhere that has done that. But when I talked to him about it, he wasn't very grandiose. He was very humble, and he said, you really could appreciate the power of this animal, but also, with bears, as you're trying to do something with them or pin them down, you can feel them rolling within their own hide.
Huh.
Right? So you're trying to, with a guy, you pin his shoulders down, you can feel those shoulders aren't going anywhere. But with the bear, you're pinning him down, maybe holding him down by the fur or whatever. You can feel his shoulders rolling around inside his hide. And he said after that happened, like the bear had no interest to spend any time with him at all. But yeah, just one of those pieces of Canadian lore that's just
wow.
Now with animal rights and all these things, you'll never see a bear in a wrestling match again.
Absolutely.
But in that era, I mean, that sure would have been something to see.
Absolutely. All right. So you also happen to mention Tony Condello, someone who you happen to have toured with.
Yeah.
Do you happen to have any interesting death tour stories?
Tony is a guy. He was. I first met Tony in 1994, and tried to get booked with him. At that time, I was under 200 pounds, and he said, "No, I won't book you. You're too small." And it took me 5 years to get booked with Tony Condello.
Mm-hmm.
And then even then, I got booked on the tour as a referee. I only got to wrestle because halfway through the tour, guys had left and they were short a guy. And so they put me in, and he goes, you're actually a pretty good little wrestler. And then I was booked on everything for him for the next 2 or 3 years. Tony is really a throwback to the carny days of wrestling. And I think that, in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s, in the 90s, his success was really could really be attributed to Don Callis. Mm-hmm. So Don Callis was a career-driven guy. Of course, he went on to success with the WWF and then ECW and then TNA, and now he's a vice president with Impact.
Yeah.
But Don was, the total package. He had a good look. He could talk. So he was a credible main eventer. So they could bring guys in like Jumpin' Jim Brunzell or Rick Martel or whatever to work with Don Callis. And it was because of the connection with Rick Martel that Don eventually got his tryout and spot with the WWF.
Huh.
They were supposed to go as a tag team. And then just as the contract got signed, Rick Martel sort of used that as leverage to get a deal with WCW and get a bigger contract. So Don got there, and then they had nothing for him to do. So he was then the manager of the Truth Commission, and then the Oddities, and then he was left there after he was released and went to ECW. And has had continued success. But Don, in that ascent of his career in the mid-90s, was in touch with the business. He had toured South Africa. He had toured Germany. I think he'd been to Japan. So he was connected with the Chris Jerichos and Lance Storms and Dr. Luther and Rick Titan and all these guys who were making a name for themselves at the same time. So he would bring them into Winnipeg. They would do their thing. And because of Don, it was like a new lease on life for Tony. But Tony himself, his success is almost he's successful despite himself. He's a character, and if I just knew him as a promoter and never did business with him, I would probably still love him. I don't, because now he's in his 70s and he's lost touch with reality, lost touch with the business. You consider that at one time, he's booking shows with Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, Edge, Christian, Rhino, Jerry Lynn, and that's the tier that he set. And now it's like, well, let's just find the greenest guys who will work for the cheapest and put the show out so that I can make the most profit. But it's not the same.
And then he's still running on these are the people that I produced in the 90s.
Absolutely. So, he just did his Northern tour. And there was a poster where he actually was advertising It, the clown, and had a picture of Tim Curry.
What?
As It on the poster. And it said, Hollywood stars. Well, whoever you bring in this It gimmick to the town, first of all, people know that that's like from the 80s. Mm-hmm. But as soon as that guy shows up in front of a crowd, they're going to be like, this is not
It's not Bill Skarsgård, and it's definitely not Tim Curry.
This is not the guy from the movie. And it was the same thing in the late 90s when he had a replica Doink suit made and had different guys wrestling as Doink. Like, the costume wasn't even the same. And if you got a guy that really sort of cared and put in the effort, then the face paint would be the same.
Yeah.
But a lot of guys didn't, and it would be like cheesy face paint, and he'd show up and sell autograph signings at restaurants with Doink, and you'd have this guy show up in a goofy singlet that hadn't been washed in 3 nights, and crappy face paint, and in a family restaurant somewhere like a Perkins that sponsored, and be like, wait a minute, this isn't the guy from the WWF. I've worked with him in recent years as a ring announcer and helped him with a front man on some of his shows, but I've certainly lost a lot of respect for him. But in terms of the ice roads, people really can't fathom, especially in the lower mainland of BC, where we never really get that cold. I mean, here in the Okanagan a little bit, where it's cold enough where people are out there ice fishing. Not necessarily thick enough for them to drive vehicles out on.
Yeah.
But in northern Manitoba, there's conditions usually for about 3 to 4 weeks a year in late January, early February, where the ice gets thick enough. And these communities otherwise are fly-in communities. They're so remote in northern Manitoba that fly in all their supplies. And as a result, it's an expensive environment to live in, where a 4-liter jug of milk might be $10, $20. Mind you, the other confections, like Pepsi, is still the same price that it is in southern Manitoba.
Yeah.
So this is why you have a lot of malnutrition in the area, because the stuff they can afford is the junk food, and the perishable items like the fresh fruit and the milk and things like that are at a premium. But one of the ironies of the tour, though, is you think about the ice roads as being the dangerous part. Like, now here you are on an open lake, and as you're driving, you can hear like crackling under the wheels, and you might be driving for 10 miles across this lake. And so a lot of guys have cracked on that tour, because Tony will play games with them, and the windows rolled down. He'd be like, "Oh, you hear that cracking? I don't think that's good. Like, we're gonna go." So guys like Scott Norton in particular, they didn't fare well on that tour, like mentally. Rhino, I mean, there's been a story on the WWE Network where Edge and Christian have said Rhino was crying, and Rhino says, "I definitely wasn't crying," but they say, "Yeah, you were." Things like that where you go through the ice. But actually the most treacherous part of the trip is actually the roads between the ice roads, because it's like basically just bulldozed muskeg through the wilderness, so it's bumpy and rough, and then when you finally get to the ice road and have like a smooth drive for 10 minutes, you actually welcome that. But particularly when American guys come up, or BC guys that have never seen weather like that, minus 40 degrees Celsius plus the wind chill, and then you're out on a frozen lake and you look like way off in the horizon and you can see a tree line. The reality is, if that van went through the ice, even if you bailed out and are standing on the ice, by the time you would get to a shore, you would have died of exposure anyway. So you're done. But very, very rough tours. And if you get to a town, the reason the tour has a couple of different names, and one of them is the Death Tour. And the reason that they call it the Death Tour is it's the custom of the culture that if somebody dies in the community, the whole town shuts down for a week in mourning. So the store shuts down, the school shuts down. So you might drive 23 hours to get to the town, and then they say, "Oh, we had a death this morning.
Oh, dang.
Wrestling's canceled tonight." And so there you are. Like, you're not on a per week guarantee, you're on a per night. You need to perform to get paid. So now you're out of night's pay. Meanwhile, you're still eating the food, that you've hauled in there yourself, because you're bringing it in. It's too expensive to buy from the northern store up there. And you've got a night off. And so if you get a bad winter, there could be as many as 6 deaths. And so you're booked on a 2-week tour and you had 6 nights off. It's rough.
Work 8 days.
Yeah.
Maybe most.
Yeah. So
drive times.
So you really hope that you hustle at, the merchandise table and sell your 8x10s, for a chance to make money coming out. The worst is, one tour we were on, we were at connecting towns, and so there was like a short ice road. It was only going to be about a 3-hour drive from one town to the next, But somebody had been out there with, their snowmobile or something. They were messing around. They went to where the ice was thin. Now the ice was compromised. They had gone through. So that ice road was closed. So instead of the 3-hour drive, we now had to go around the lake the long way and come into the town from the other way. So it was a 23-hour drive. So we did our show that night. We wrestled. Everybody, hauls ass, gets the ring back in the van, and quick bite to eat. But then you're back on the road. Drive overnight, all night long, just to get to the next town in time to set the ring up and start the show an hour late. And you have a few shows like that where over the course of that 2 weeks you'll drive 1,100 kilometers.
Wow.
In wilderness. And when you come out of that, and you get back to Winnipeg, you're just so grateful to see civilization and see stores and restaurants that you recognize, and there's no hotels in these communities. So you're wrestling, you're bringing your own sleeping bag with you. If you're lucky and you get there fast enough, when you tear down the ring, you might get one of the mats off the ring to sleep on. In later years, when I was on the tour, guys were thinking ahead and bringing air mattresses, and plug-in air pumps. And so they kind of had a level of comfort. But, you wrestle in a school gymnasium, you cook your dinner in the home ec room. You might get access to AV and you can watch some videos or something, and maybe hook up a video camera if somebody taped the show and watch it back. But you're sleeping right on the gymnasium floor, where you've just performed. It's very, very rough. And I've seen a lot of guys, by the end of it, just crack. In more recent years, Johnny Obsession was a guy from the West Coast. He did that tour. He didn't really survive. And when he got back, he took time off from wrestling completely. Adam Fedek is a guy from Kelowna who actually started. He was Colin Cutler's first tag team partner.
Okay.
He did that tour. When he finished that tour, he quit wrestling.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was just done. It just mentally breaks you down. So with a good crew and where everybody gets along, and that's great. It's a rough tour. With a bad crew, where there's conflict and fighting among the crew, it's brutal.
Wow.
Brutal tour.
Wow, all right. So before I let you go, I just have one last question.
Sure.
Do you have any tips for anyone who might happen to be going on a tour, whether it happens to be for CWE or whatever the promotion happens to be, as someone who has toured for numerous promotions, for someone who maybe necessarily hasn't had the opportunity to hit the road yet? What are some tips and tricks that you might be able to give those individuals?
I think the first important thing about touring is, first of all, it's not how much you make, it's how much you save. You're not going to get rich on independent wrestling. So if you know that the promoter is typically a $50 a night guy, you got to think about how you're going to budget for that, because you don't want to come home in the hole. So you might be packing your cans of tuna and your Ichiban noodles, with you, or you're living off your protein shakes, instead of spending $20 at a restaurant for a meal. Or if you get to a town or you're on a tour for 3 days or longer, 3 meals a day in a restaurant, your money's gone before you've been paid. Always think about merchandising, whether you're a villain or you're a hero. Have your merchandise, be out there at the table flogging it, because sometimes your merchandise is the make or break of you being able to make money or lose money. Make sure that you negotiate your deal. If the promoter says we want to pay you this, make sure that you're getting what you need, and be willing to compromise. So if they say, our budget is $50, and you say, listen, I really need $100 to make this worthwhile, just to break even, not even including consideration of lost wages that from not working your real job. Know what your number is and be happy with that number. And if you negotiate to $50 and you figure out how you're going to make that work, with your merchandise sales or other ways you're going to save money, you're going to, if you're sharing a hotel room, now you're putting 5 guys in a hotel room and splitting that 5 ways instead of everybody having their own room. These are all sacrifices that are age old in wrestling. They call it healing a room. So one guy will go and check in, yep, just me, and then pile everybody else in, and you're flipping the coin to see who gets the bed and who gets the floor. And if you're going to take the mattress off and somebody gets the box spring or whatever your deal is, always look at ways to save money. I think the last thing I could say about touring is always remember that the ego and the superstar status is for the people, not for the locker room. So if you've been brought in as the headliner, it's because the promoter thinks that the customers that are buying the tickets believe you're a headliner. Chances are the guys in the back know that you're just a guy like they are. And so if you pull your superstar bullshit in the locker room, you can expect that you're going to have a very rough tour. And you might find, you're going to wrestle the next night and you can't find your wrestling boot. Somebody your boot is missing, or you come back and your suitcase has been super glued shut, or you're looking for your shoes after your match and somebody has nailed them into the ceiling of the locker room. The superstar attitudes don't fly in wrestling, and particularly as you get to higher levels in the industry, the hazing that takes place because of that behavior is not for the faint of heart. And Alice Cooper, says the same thing of his band about egos on the road. He says, when we're on stage, people have paid to see rock and roll superstars, rock and roll gods. Like, get your ego out there, be a superstar on stage, like, give them all of that. But then when the show lights go down and we go to the back, we're just dudes. And so you always want to be humble and hungry. And that is probably the best advice I could give to anybody that's looking to be a touring professional wrestler and be successful.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for both of the conversations we had here today.
Awesome.
All right.
My pleasure.
And a truly big, roaring Desert Tiger podcast thank you to Vance Nevada, a champion among men, a heavyweight champion among men, for joining us once again here on the Desert Tiger podcast. I also want to go ahead and thank you guys, the Ambush, for checking out this episode of the DTP. If you're new with the podcast, maybe you want to go ahead and hit the subscribe button on whatever service you're listening on. Maybe you want to go ahead and review the show on iTunes. I only say that because iTunes is the one that happens to offer a star rating system for reviews. So, a 5-star rating would be fantastic over on there. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode enough, maybe you want to go ahead and share it. And if you do, I would be ecstatic if you went ahead and tagged me, the Colton G, the Desert Tiger podcast, or Vance Nevada when you do, so that we can go ahead and show you a little bit of love when you do so. Next week on the show, we're going to be returning to the musical realms. I can't exactly diverge who our guest is going to be because they have a album that they plan on announcing that day, and as of right now, it is a surprise. So we can't tell you anything as of that right now. I just want you to know that it's going to be another amazing week here at the Desert Tiger podcast, and I can't wait to talk to you then. And until then, you guys, you already know what's up. I'm going to tell you that it is time to go out and find your passion, your dream, or as I like to call it, your mountain, so that you can begin to climb it. And of course, as you climb, there's going to be things that get in your way. You're going to get tired. There's going to be rocks that fall out from underneath your feet. And that is adversity, and right now we're going through a lot of adversity, but that's okay because adversity is what makes us stronger, and we're going to be some mighty strong tigers after all of this is done. So until next week, stay happy, stay healthy, wash your hands, and bye-bye.